microgreens are a brilliant little crop that you can grow indoors, and you can grow them pretty much all year round as well, so they're really perfect for autumn and winter growing, and especially really good if you have only got a small space. So you can see here I've got 3 different varieties of microgreens, and I've been growing these on my windowsill for the past couple of weeks. So what are microgreens? Basically, microgreens is just a fancy way of saying baby plant. So microgreens can actually be any of a whole variety of different vegetables and herbs and leafy greens, and they're just sown very thickly and then harvested when they're really not much past the kind of initial seedling stage. So usually they'd either be harvested when they just have their little seed leaves, which are their very first 2 leaves to appear, or when they have their first set of true leaves. And often the difference between the seed leaves and the true leaves is that the seed leaves will be a slightly different shape. And like I said, they're the first ones to appear, and they often don't look the same as all the following leaves. So for instance, for something like rocket, you would get a little set of kind of kidney-shaped seed leaves, and then the next set and all of the subsequent sets will be the sort of little spiky kind of rocket-shaped leaves that you would recognise. So basically, they're harvested when they are very young, and because of that, they're really, really fast to grow. So for the most part, you can harvest your microgreens, partly depends on the time of year, from anything from a sort of a week to 3 weeks after you sow them. So they're brilliant for all of you impatient gardeners, myself included. So I've got 3 different varieties here, like I said. So we've got coriander, which is a really tasty one. We've got cress, which is super fast and a really good one to sort of practice with. It's usually quite reliable. And we've also got some mizuna, which is a little bit of a kind of peppery leaf, similar to rocket. So why grow microgreens? So like I said, they are really easy to grow. They're very fast. You can grow them indoors. You can grow them all year round. You don't need very much equipment. And they're also really good for you. So they're packed full of vitamins and nutrients, and also because you're growing them in your house, you're getting to sort of harvest and eat them when they are super fresh. So if you want to have a go at starting to grow your own microgreens, you don't need very much equipment at all. You basically need just a shallow tray, preferably with holes in. So what I've used here are just sort of little standard half seed trays, and you can use bigger ones as well. And you can also repurpose, so things like the mushroom trays that have already got holes in the base are perfect. And then anything else that you could sort of safely put some holes in the base of yourself for drainage would do the trick. I've also got a little tray without holes in, and that's really good just for sitting your tray in to make sure that you're not making a mess, especially if you need to water them. So yeah, something to grow in. And then you're also going to need a growing medium like compost. So any sort of peat-free general purpose compost will work absolutely fine, and you don't need very much of it. You're sowing probably only in about an inch deep of compost, so you'll not use very much with each sowing. You could also use something like cocoa coir. So you often will see that in blocks like this. That means it's a little bit easier to transport and to handle and to store. So that can be quite a handy one to try. And basically what happens is you will soak this in a bucket, and it will expand and turn into something that sort of more resembles a compost. And it's great for growing microgreens as well, so you might want to try that. Other things that you will need, always useful to have something to label with. I've got a little spray bottle here as well. Sometimes when you initially sow your seeds, if your compost is very dry, you might want to water. I tend to avoid watering with a watering can because sometimes that can sort of move the seeds around or sort of wash them all up to the sides of your pot after you've carefully sown them. So something like a little spray bottle for watering can be really helpful as well. So lastly, you're going to need some seeds, and you've got a huge variety to choose from. You could try any of the different leafy greens you might grow, so things like kale, or chard, mizuna, rocket. There are lots of different herbs that you might like to try as well, so coriander is a good one. It's a little bit slower than some of the other microgreens you might grow, but the flavour is so good that it's a really nice one to try. You could also try basil, and sorrel is another really nice herb to do as well. So you will obviously use quite a lot of seeds. You'll see just how thickly these trays are sown. So you might want to kind of hunt around for places that you can buy your seeds in larger packs than you might sort of traditionally. They come in little small packets for sowing for full-size vegetables, so you don't need as many seeds. So buying in bulk can be really good. The more you buy, the cheaper it gets. So maybe if you want to convince a few friends to have a go at growing microgreens as well, then you could all sort of chip in, and that will make buying your seeds a little bit cheaper. There are loads of websites now that will sell kind of bulk organic seeds, particularly for seed sprouting. So they might be a good option to try to have a look at as well. So let's take a wee look at what the process of sowing the microgreens looks like. So the first thing that we're going to do is fill up your container, your tray. So I'm just going to use a general purpose compost. And you don't even need to fill it all the way up. So like I said, just an inch or so of compost is totally fine for growing your microgreens. So one of the things you want to try to do is to get a nice flat surface. If you've got lumps in the compost, just break those up as you go. A wee little bit more in there. The reason that you want a flat surface is to help you spread the seeds as evenly as possible. If your compost has lots of little sort of high bits and low bits, little dips, then often what will happen is that as you sprinkle the seed, particularly for little round seeds, is that they'll tend just to sort of roll in to the low bits. So what I'm going to do, I'll put my compost down here, is I've got a little bit of cardboard here that I've just cut to the size of the tray, and I'm just going to use that. Now you don't want to press too hard because you definitely still want the compost to drain well, so you don't want to squish it too much, but that's just going to help us get a nice flat surface there for sowing. So we're going to use cress today, and the seeds are very similar to a lot of the other microgreens that you might grow in size. So they're sort of roughly the same kind of size as quite a few of your cabbage family plants, and like lettuce and other leafy greens. So what we're going to do, so just take a wee pinch and we're going to scatter those over the surface. Now, you do really have to sow them quite thickly. You're sort of aiming roughly for the space in between the seeds to be about the size of the seed itself. So you will go through quite a lot of seeds, especially the teeny tiny ones like this. There we go. There might be some slightly bigger seeds that you handle. So radish are a little bit bigger. If you're sowing things like chard, they're a little bit easier to handle, and you can kind of move them around if you need to alter the spacing. With the little teeny ones, it's a little bit more fiddly. And it really doesn't matter if some of the seeds are touching, like that's going to happen. If you find that you've got little clusters, you can always kind of go in and move them around. But that's the kind of thickness that you're going to kind of aim for. Probably even get away with putting a few more in than that, to be honest. So once you've sown your seeds, what we're going to do is just take a wee drop of compost and cover them over. You really don't need to put a thick layer on. So again, you know, if your seeds are very, very small, just a really fine layer. Don't want to bury them too deep because otherwise it'll be harder for them to get up and out of the compost. We'll go with just enough compost to cover them. Go. Now, this compost is quite moist already, so I don't think it needs a huge amount of watering. What you could do, if your compost wasn't damp, before you start, and you can also use this method throughout to water your microgreens once they start growing, you can put a little bit of water in the tray and then pop your tray in there. Is this gonna spill over? No. Oh, I think we're good. What you can do is then just let that compost sort of soak up the water. Make sure after a few minutes that you lift it back out again and just drain away any extra water that is still sitting there, because you really don't want your compost to be really soggy, because that's not going to be good for the seeds germinating. So the other thing that you can do, just to keep the compost moist on the surface, because that's going to be the quickest bit to dry out, is that every day or two just have a wee look before your seeds start sprouting, and if the compost surface looks a little bit dry, then using a little spray bottle or mister can be good. So you could just give it a wee spray like that, just to keep that surface damp. The other thing that you can do, once you get to this stage, is that it can actually be quite helpful to weigh down the surface of the soil. So you could use just another tray that will fit in like this, and then on top of that you could either take a tray of greens that you're already growing and stack that on top, or if you don't have microgreens already on the go, you could just get something to weigh this down, so a couple of tins or something else. And the reason that you might want to do that is because having that little bit of weight as the seeds begin to start sprouting, it helps to encourage the roots to all push down the way and get well rooted in the soil, especially when you're sowing so thickly. Sometimes what can happen if we don't weigh them down is that as all these seeds start to germinate, they sort of push up on that top layer of compost. And whilst that's not a massive problem, it can mean that once your seeds get to this kind of stage, you find that actually sort of floating on the surface of your microgreens are little sort of clumps of compost that have been pushed up as the seeds have grown. So that's a way to avoid that. And then the very last thing you want to remember to do is to write yourself a little label. This is the thing that I always forget. So you might want to stick the name of the microgreen on it, but then you might also want just to pop the date on there so that you don't forget when you've sown them. And most microgreens will grow really quickly, so if you've weighted it down, what you want to do is just check and see if it needs a spray every couple of days, and then also when you see all the seeds starting to push up and emerge, then you can lift that weight off. So once they've started to sprout and you've lifted the weight off, you want to pop them somewhere that they're going to get a reasonable amount of light, and within a week or two you should have a really nice wee healthy crop of microgreens like these. So these are 2 weeks old, and I've just had them on my kitchen windowsill. If you've got a windowsill that's south facing, then that's going to give you the most light, but really microgreens grow so quickly that they will pretty much grow
in any in any window, as long as you give them a few hours of light each day. What will happen, particularly because we are in Scotland, and yeah, we don't get as much light at this time of year, is that your seedlings will get a little bit sort of stretched looking. Now, if you have a look, so if I had grown these in the middle of summer, or grown them under a grow light, somewhere that they were getting all of the light they needed, they wouldn't have such big long stems with the leaves kind of perched on top. The reason that happens is because they will sort of stretch to try and find the light. You'll see as well that they're sort of bending slightly in one direction. That's because I haven't turned them today. Usually it can help a little bit just to get a more even sort of spread of light and to encourage the growth to grow up instead of over, if you just lift them and turn them each day like this, and that helps them to get a little bit of light on all sides of the seedling. But yeah, it certainly doesn't affect the flavour. They're still totally possible to grow them right the way through the year.
So once you've sown your microgreens, you won't have too long to wait before you get to harvest them. Harvesting is really straightforward. Probably the easiest way to do it is just with a wee pair of scissors, or garden snips. And basically all you're going to do is snip the plant. You can go quite close to the compost. There we go. And you see there, you've got your microgreens. So always give them a wee rinse before you eat them, as you would with any other vegetable. And yeah, that's pretty much all there is to it. There are loads of different ways to enjoy microgreens. Some of my favourite things to do with them, really like just depending on the flavour of the particular microgreen, and just using them to sort of sprinkle on any other dish that I might be making. So you can use the herbs to stick on top of things like soups and stews, things like the leafy greens, like your cress or your rocket, are brilliant just mixed through other salads that you might be making. You can throw them in if you're making a pesto. They're also really good sprinkled on top of a stir fry. I really like them if I'm having something on like a sandwich or toast or oatcakes, and then adding a little bit of one of my microgreens on top of that as well makes it a little bit more interesting. So yeah, experiment and see what you enjoy using for it. So I think that's us for today. I hope you have a go. I'd love to hear how you get on. So do keep in touch, and you can share your photos and your growing experiences with us on our Facebook. So head over there and yeah, let us know how to go. Thanks. Bye.